In 1970, a group of engineers in Lansing, Michigan finished building an engine, 455 cubic inches, a V8, and 32 valves. 4 valves in every cylinder at a time when every American V8 on sale had 2. It made 440 horsepower in a mild state of tune. It was, on paper, the most advanced engine in America. And when the project was cancelled, Oldsmobile handed it to a group of magazine writers and told them to get rid of it, not to store it, not to send it back, to take it away and dispose of it. This is the story of the engine General Motors did not want to exist, and of the man who could not bring himself to throw it away. To understand why this engine was built, you have to understand a rule. An invisible rule inside General Motors that shaped American cars for 6 years. From 1964, GM told its own divisions this: no intermediate car may be fitted with an engine larger than 400 cubic inches. Not Chevrolet, not Pontiac, not Oldsmobile, not Buick. 400 cubic inches. That was the ceiling. The reason was corporate. GM did not want its mid-size cars embarrassing the Corvette. And it did not want the public thinking General Motors was in a horsepower race. So the divisions were capped, and here is what happened next. Instead of stopping the engineers, the rule made them creative. If you cannot have more cubic inches, you have to get more out of the ones you have. Oldsmobile, in particular, took this personally, because Oldsmobile had a problem with its own image. It was the sensible division, the doctor's car, the bank manager's car. Comfortable, respectable, invisible. And a group of engineers inside Oldsmobile did not want to build the bank manager's car, so they invented a character. An advertising character in a white lab coat with wild hair and thick glasses. They called him Dr. Oldsmobile. And the cars he supposedly built carried a code. The letter W, W30, W31, W32. If your Oldsmobile had a W in the order code, it had been to the laboratory. It was the same trick Chrysler played with the Hemi and Ford with the Cobra Jet. A badge that told other people at the traffic lights what they were dealing with. And then, in 1970, the rule came down. General Motors lifted the 400 cubic inch ban. Overnight, every division could put a big engine in a mid-size car. Oldsmobile was ready. It dropped its 455 cubic inch V8 into the 442. And in W30 form, the factory said it made 370 horsepower, 500 pound-feet of torque. 500 in 1970. Almost everybody who has tested one since says the real figure was higher, closer to 400 horsepower. The factory understated it on purpose because of insurance companies. Only 1,032 of those cars were built. And it should have been the high point. A great engine in a great car at exactly the right moment. Except that the 455 in the 442 was not the engine Oldsmobile had been working on. It was the safe one. The one they could actually build. Because since the autumn of 1967, in a corner of the engineering department, a small team had been building something else entirely. They called it the W43. And to understand what made it extraordinary, you need to understand what an engine valve does. Every time a cylinder fires, it needs to breathe. Air and fuel in through one valve, burnt gas out through another. 2 valves per cylinder, that was the American standard. It had been the American standard for 50 years. The problem is simple geometry. A cylinder is a circle, and you can only fit a circle so big inside another circle. Make the valve bigger, and eventually it hits the cylinder wall. So there is a hard limit on how much an engine can breathe. Unless you stop using one big valve, and start using 2 small ones. 2 small intake valves, side by side, have more total area than 1 large valve. More area means more air. More air means more power. This is not a secret. Engineers had known it since the 1920s. Bugatti knew it. Peugeot knew it. It won Grand Prix races before the Second World War. But it was complicated and expensive, and American V8s did not need it. When you have 7 liters, you do not need to be clever. And there is one more reason Oldsmobile was in a hurry. Because across town, Chrysler had the Hemi. 426 cubic inches with hemispherical combustion chambers, and valves so large they had to be tilted to fit. The Hemi was the thing every engineer in Detroit measured himself against. And the Hemi had a weakness. It solved the breathing problem by making the valves bigger and the chamber bigger, and therefore the engine bigger and heavier and more expensive to build. It was brute force applied with great elegance. The Oldsmobile engineers looked at that and asked a different question. What if you did not make the valves bigger at all? What if you just used more of them? The Oldsmobile team decided to be clever anyway. They took the 455 block, and they designed a completely new cylinder head. 4 valves in every cylinder, 32 valves in total. The intake valves were 1 3/4 inches across. The exhausts, 1 3/8. Add it all up, and the new head gave the engine 43% more intake valve area than the production 2-valve 455. 43%. And that is where the name came from. The W43, the number is not a code, it is the answer. Now, here is the part that most people get wrong. Because when people hear 32 valves, they picture overhead camshafts. They picture a Ferrari. They picture something Italian and exotic. The W43 was none of those things. It was a pushrod engine. A single camshaft sitting in the V of the block, exactly where an American V8 always puts it, driven by a chain. And from that one camshaft, 16 pushrods. 16 steel rods running up through the block, working 16 rockers, opening 32 valves. It is a magnificently stubborn piece of engineering. It refuses to abandon the American way of doing things. It just does the American way harder than anybody thought possible. And it worked. In May 1971, Hot Rod magazine published the numbers. 440 horsepower at 4,600 revolutions per minute. Read that again, 4,600. That is not a screaming race engine, that is barely above idle for a modern car. The W43 made that power load down where you can actually use it, and it did it, in the magazine's own words, in a relatively mild state of tune. Mild. The engineers had not even pushed it yet. There was an aluminium block version too. They called it the OW43. Lighter, and even further from anything General Motors was selling. So why is there not a W43 in every museum in America? Why can you not buy a 1972 Oldsmobile with 32 valves? The romantic answer is emissions, that the government came in and stopped the fun. And that is partly true. It was coming. But it is not the real reason. The real reason is duller and much more corporate. The W43 was bigger, it was heavier, and it was expensive. 32 valves means 32 valve seats, 32 springs, 16 rockers, 16 pushrods. Every one of those parts has to be machined and fitted and paid for. The cylinder heads alone were a manufacturing nightmare. And General Motors, in 1970, was asking a very simple question. Who is going to pay for this? Because the man buying a 442 did not want a clever engine. He wanted a fast one. And the ordinary 455 was already fast. It made 500 pound-feet of torque and cost a fraction as much to build. So the W43 lost. Not to the government, not to a rival. To an accountant. And there is one more thing, and it is the cruelest detail in this entire story. Remember the number 400? 400 cubic inches. General Motors' own private ceiling for 6 years. The rule the engineers spent the 60s working around. In 1970, General Motors finally took that rule away. And almost immediately, somebody else put it back. The insurance companies. They had watched the claims come in on these cars, and they had seen enough. So, they invented what they called a performance penalty. If your car had a functional bonnet scoop, you paid more. If it had a badge that said SS, or RT, or GT, or Judge, you paid more. And if your engine was larger than 400 cubic inches, you paid more. 50 to 100% more on the premium. Read that number again. 400 cubic inches. The exact figure General Motors had just abandoned. The corporation let go of the rule, and the insurance industry picked it straight up. And now it was not a policy you could argue with. It was a bill. A young man could still buy a 442 with a 455. He simply could not afford to insure it. And the fuel was about to change too. The Clean Air Act had passed, and unleaded petrol was coming. Lead had been doing two jobs in an engine. It raised the octane, and it protected the valve seats. Take it out, and the octane falls. And if the octane falls, the compression has to fall with it. For 1971, Oldsmobile dropped the compression on its engines. From 10.5 to 1, all the way down to 8.5 to 1. That is not a tweak. That is an engine having its lungs taken out. The horsepower fell across the entire industry in a single model year. And into that world, General Motors was being asked to launch. The most complicated, most expensive, highest revving cylinder head it had ever designed. The answer was always going to be no. The project was shut down in 1970. 2 W43 engines had been built for testing. And under General Motors rules, both of them should have gone to the crusher. That is what happens to experimental hardware. It is not sold, it is not given away, it is destroyed, so that nobody can put it in a car and nobody can sue you when it goes wrong. That should have been the end. But before the project was shut down, Oldsmobile had done something. It had sent one of the engines out for publicity, down to the offices of Peterson Publishing in Los Angeles, the company behind Hot Rod magazine. The idea was simple. Let the magazines photograph it. Let the enthusiasts dream. It is good for the brand, and that is why we have the photographs and the 440 horsepower figure. The magazines had it. They ran the story. And then the project was cancelled, and Oldsmobile had a problem. There was an experimental engine sitting in a magazine office in California, and the program that owned it no longer existed. So the Oldsmobile representative said the obvious thing. Get rid of it. Take it away. Dispose of it. It is not our problem now. And here's the moment the whole story turns on. Nobody could do it. Not one of the writers in that office could take a hand-built 32-valve V8, the most advanced engine General Motors had ever made, and drop it in a skip. So somebody took it home instead. And then, for the next 4 decades, nothing. No auction, no article, no museum. The most advanced American V8 of its generation simply disappeared. somewhere in Collage, somewhere in California, and the world forgot it had ever been built. Around 2007, it surfaced. Two brothers, twins, named James and John Critta, found it and bought it. And what they had was not really an engine. It was a block and a mystery. Because General Motors had never released the drawings. And they had one cylinder head. One. Not a pair. One. You cannot build a V8 with one cylinder head. So they did the only thing left to do. They reverse engineered it. They measured every port, every angle, every water passage on the head they had, and from that, they worked out what the missing one must have looked like. And they had it made. The 4-bolt main block was rebuilt. The valve train, with its 16 pushrods, was put back together. And more than 50 years after Oldsmobile told a group of journalists to throw it away, the W43 ran again. Think about what that actually means. There were no drawings. General Motors never released them. There was no second head to copy. There was no parts catalog and no supplier. And nobody left at Oldsmobile to ask, because by then there was no Oldsmobile. Everything they needed had to be read backwards, out of the metal itself. Every port measured, every angle worked out, every water passage mapped. And then the whole thing cast again, from nothing, half a century late. Today it sits in a 1970 Oldsmobile 442. Not a replica, not a tribute. The actual engine, in the actual car it was designed for, and in a conservative state of tune, it makes more than 550 horsepower. 550. From a pushrod engine designed before the moon landings were finished. So what do you do with a story like this? It is easy to make it a tragedy. The genius engine, ruined by accountants. But look at what actually happened afterwards. Because the W43 was not wrong, it was early. 4 valves per cylinder, which in 1970 was too complicated, too heavy, and too expensive, is now in essentially every petrol engine on Earth. The car you drive has 4 valves per cylinder. Your neighbor's car has 4 valves per cylinder. It is not exotic anymore, it is the baseline. And General Motors itself got there in the end? More than 20 years later, Cadillac launched the North Star, a 32-valve V8. The same idea, from the same company, 2 decades late. The engineers in Lansing were not wrong about the engineering. They were wrong about the year. And that is the thing that makes this engine worth remembering. Not that it was fast, plenty of things were fast in 1970, but that a group of men, working under a rule that told them to stop, built the future anyway, in a corner of a building in Michigan, and then watched a company decide it could not afford to sell it. The W43 does not survive because General Motors preserved it. It survives in spite of General Motors. It survives because somebody was told to throw away the most interesting engine in America and could not do it.